There we go.
Okay. Are you going to hand the reins over to me now?
Yep. How about it?
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. As Carl already told you, my name is Joshua Hunt. I was born and raised on the west side of Cleveland, and I am Southern Cheyenne. I'm an enrolled member of Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, which is a federally recognized tribal nation here in the United States. And today I'm going to talk to you about, first I'm going to introduce myself, let you know who I am as a person, as a Cheyenne person, as an indigenous person. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Cheyenne history to give you a little bit of that background. And then I'm going to talk to you about the mascot issue, the core arguments and for eliminating them. So we'll start with, this is me with my sister and our Uncle Wayne. So here's one example of a Native American family spending the holiday season in Cleveland in the 21st century. And here I am a few years ago with my sister and our mother. And again, here is just one example of a Native American family celebrating the holidays in Cleveland in the 21st century. And this is my father, Mark. And this is my wife, Ginger. We've been married for almost 10 years now. And like some of you, I'm sure, I have a fur baby. This is Gavi. This is when we first brought her home almost 10 years ago. I've fallen in love with cats thanks to my partner, my spouse, and it's enriched my life. And like you, like many of you, I have obsessions, I have interests and hobbies and things like that. I have shows, TV shows that I'm obsessed with. And so, for example, a few years ago, I went to 4 different Goodwill stores to put together my 11 costume from Stranger Things because I just love that show so much. As I said, I'm Southern Cheyenne, and there's also the Northern Cheyenne in Montana on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and the Southern Cheyenne are in Oklahoma with Southern Arapaho, and the Northern Arapaho are on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. So the Arapaho are the Cheyenne's closest allies and have been for about 2 centuries. So this is the Northern Cheyenne flag. This symbol is known as the Morning Star. The Northern Cheyenne are known as the Morning Star people, named for Chief Morning Star, whom you see on the left. The Euro-Americans came to call him Chief Dull Knife. And then on the right, you see standing next to Chief Dull Knife, you see Chief Little Wolf. These are both significant, important leaders amongst the Cheyenne. And I never knew about them until a few years ago. Like you, I was only taught about white heroes like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, never about these Cheyenne heroes that helped fight against settler colonialism. And this is the flag of the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho. You see the outline of Oklahoma, because that's where our tribal offices and lands are based right now, in Western Oklahoma. And since we are 2 tribal nations united as one, you can see the 2 arrows facing downward, signaling that these 2 nations are together with peace with one another, and the crisscrossed with the peace pipe, again, signaling that these 2 nations are at peace with one another, a united nations of sorts. This is another hero of the Cheyenne. Black Kettle was a peace chief of the Cheyenne, the Southern Cheyenne, and he tried in vain to maintain peace and keep peace between the Cheyenne and the Euro-American government, the U.S. Army and government. He escaped narrowly with his life, his own and his wife's life, at the massacre of Sand Creek in 1864, just to be cut down by Custer and his 7th Cavalry at the Washita River Massacre in 1868. So again, a very important leader and person of the Cheyenne people, of Cheyenne history, that I was never taught. And I never had a Cheyenne elder in my life to teach me about this history or about cultural ways or anything like that. But thankfully, I found this book, which may be the closest I'll ever get to that. This is a book called Cheyenne Memories by John Stands and Timber. He's a Northern Cheyenne person, and for a long time, he was the tribal historian. And then he met Margot Liberty, who is a white anthropologist who wrote his story down, essentially, his interviews down in this book. And again, it's the closest I think I'll get to being able to learn from a Cheyenne elder, our history and other important things. And at one point I actually thought, because everyone is socialized to think like this in the United States, even indigenous people, I actually thought that there's no way for me to learn any of this history. There's no way for me to learn any of these cultural ways of the Cheyenne because they're all dead and gone, like the dinosaurs. And I'm glad that I unlearned that falsehood. And I'm so happy and glad that there are many books for me to learn from. There are many Cheyenne and Arapaho members that I can learn from and I've connected with on Facebook, through email. So we're not all dead. Cheyenne people are still alive, and there's so much for me to learn still. And I'm grateful for that, because so many people who are indigenous, they don't have this library to learn from. Obviously, I wanted to connect with relatives from the past. And this is a nice photograph of my Cheyenne great-great-grandfather with my great-great-grandmother. Sitting here, you see Robert Sandhill, and next to him is his wife, stands silent. So what I love about this photo, one of the things is my Cheyenne relatives here are not just a black and white name on an old document. This brings them to life a little more. And I was so grateful that I got to share this photograph with my Cheyenne grandfather, who had never seen it in his 80 plus years of life. When he looked at it, he said to me, one of the things that really excited him was, he said to me, look at the women. Look at the moccasins that the women are wearing. They're wearing beaded moccasins. I wore moccasins like that when I was a kid in our Cheyenne community in Oklahoma when I was a kid. So that gave me a lot of joy to share that with him, that we both got to see these Cheyenne relatives of ours. As was mentioned, I earned my undergrad at Cleveland State, and I had the opportunity to take a couple of Native American history courses. They have a Native Studies minor there, and I was able to take a couple of courses, and they gave me this really nice overview of US history and indigenous peoples' history of the US from before Christopher Columbus, the so-called pre-Columbian times, to present day. So amongst other things, I got what was life like here before European encroachment and invasion? What is it like now? What are the contemporary issues and struggles and politics now of various indigenous communities? Because we are still alive and living in the 21st century. And then after those courses, I turned my attention to the Cleveland Major League Baseball team and its Native American mascot and team name. And it filled me with anger. It filled me with this desire to have them eliminate that immediately, to change that name. And I couldn't put my finger on why. I didn't understand the why yet. I couldn't articulate that to anyone, let alone myself. But knowing that history, having those classes to serve as a background, it already filled me with those feelings, those thoughts of considering that history, the dominant culture treating Native people like this, as mascots, as symbols, as tokens or whatever, that seems really wrong to me, and I think it should change. So just having that background already got me there, even though I couldn't articulate the reasons why. And those classes also inspired me not only to learn my Cheyenne history and cultural ways and things like that, it made me want to learn about this issue and get involved with the Native American community here in Northeast Ohio. So this was one of my first demonstrations outside of progressive field, or as I like to call it, regressive field. And I've been going ever since, and getting to know our Native community here and getting to know all of our supporters as well. It's been a very enriching experience. Christopher Columbus is also an issue, and how he is lionized and celebrated as a hero. So I got involved with those kinds of actions as well. This is Columbus Day in Little Italy in 2018. And one of the city council members in Cleveland took it on himself, without talking to any of the natives in our community, to abolish Columbus Day, replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. So there was news coverage of that about a year or so ago. And my parents were nice enough to capture this image of me on Fox 8 when they covered it. So, so that leads me to today and what I'm going to talk to you today about. The why, because that's really important too. And I got obsessed with trying to understand and pull out those reasons and that evidence and try to articulate it in a way that's palatable or easy to understand and things like that, and really get at the core of it. So why should these mascots and team names be changed and eliminated immediately? Well, for one, they perpetuate racist stereotypes of Native Americans, and they harm Native Americans as well. And they also harm non-natives as well. And there's scientific evidence to show that. And finally, it's non-native people that control these mascots, that control this imagery of natives. So the dominant culture controlling how people view and see us as people is also why these should change. So I'm going to now elaborate and expand on each of these points. So the mascots they perpetuate racist stereotypes. And if you look at the literature and understand how academics have studied this, they've identified two major stereotypes of Native Americans. There's the noble savage stereotype. And this is the stereotype that conveys the notion that all Native Americans are primitive, are childlike, are one with nature, things like that. We talk to the animals, we talk to the trees. Then there's the bloodthirsty savage stereotype. And this stereotype conveys the notion that all Native Americans are wild, aggressive, violent, and brave. And it's the bloodthirsty savage stereotype that is most appealing to sports fans. And we see this in the very words of sports fans that have whose favorite sports team that they support has a native mascot. For example, this person who says, I can think of no greater tribute to the American Indian than to name a team's warriors after courageous, cunning, and feared warriors of the Indian nations, the Braves. Or this person who says, I look at that mascot, that Indian head, and it stirs me up. I think of getting real aggressive, and it brings out the aggressiveness in me. And it makes me go out there and really wrestle hard and fight hard, because that's what those Indians were. So you see both quotes from two different sports fans are perpetuating the bloodthirsty savage stereotype. And the second quote is also perpetuating the idea that Native Americans don't exist anymore. We only exist in the past, in the 1800s. Because he says they fight hard, because that's what those Indians were. Talking about us in the past tense, which is also a problem. And the bloodthirsty savage stereotype is alive and well in the minds of Cleveland baseball fans, like this one who says, no one wants to play for a team called the losers or the weaklings. No, the Indian is a fierce warrior willing to do anything to fight for what is right. People feel pride by wearing Chief Wahoo. So again, the idea that all Native Americans are wild, aggressive, violent, and brave is the stereotype that is perpetuated by these sports teams. And we can see it in the very words of sports fans, like this Cleveland baseball fan. And that fan mentioned the Indian head. He looks at that Indian head and it really stirs him up and gets him all aggressive and ready to fight. And there's a missing historical context to that, because every time you look and see a Native mascot, it's always a disembodied floating Native American head of a male warrior or chief of the Great Plains. And what we need to understand is that there's a history here of genocide and conquest where blood bounties were put out by the US Army and governments and state governments to kill Native Americans, men, women, and children. And we'll give you money if you kill Native people. And how are you going to prove that you've killed Native people? Well, they would bring in the decapitated heads of Native men, women, and children as proof that they had made their kills and would collect money via that. Carrying around decapitated heads would become too cumbersome, so these white settlers would then just bring in the scalps, the red skins of Native people as proof to collect that blood bounty. So and there's a history of white settlers killing Native leaders who led resistance movements against that white encroachment, and then would kill that leader, dismember him, and put his decapitated head on a spike as a warning. Hey, Native people, if you get out of line, here's what'll happen to you. So each one of these symbols that you've seen, I'm sure, is a disembodied, decapitated Native head that is a symbol of that violent genocidal history. And here, Chief Wahoo did it with a smile. There's nothing to smile about that. So each one of these is a reminder of that genocidal history. And we can see, if we look at fan behavior, which is also a problem. For example, this fan carries on that tradition of his ancestors when he goes to games. And he brings his decapitated Native head on a spike to it. because it's not his team that has the native mascot. No, it's his favorite sports team's rivals that have the native mascot. So, for example, the Chicago Blackhawks is the big rival team of his favorite team. So he brings his decapitated Native American head on a spike to show his love and support of his team. And then he would take it to football games too, because of the Washington NFL team with their dictionary defined racial slur of a name. So he would carry his severed Indian head around, carrying on a tradition that his ancestors carried out. And he doesn't even realize it, that this is him carrying out a sort of act of violence, even if it's in a symbolic way. He's carrying on that tradition of his ancestors murdering Native people and then putting their heads on spikes. And then we think about what are some of the most common sports mascots that exist, both on the professional level, the college level, the public school level. Well, Native Americans, but also animals, non-human, violent, predatory animals, and inanimate objects. So to use and symbolize Native Americans in the exact same way as violent, predatory animals is dehumanizing and racist, to say the least. So we can imagine for a second, if I wanted to start my own local sports team here, what am I going to call my team? What's my team name going to be? And what's the mascot or logo going to be? Well, I want to make sure that it's something that's going to strike fear into the hearts of my opponents before we even set foot out onto the field. So what could I name it? I could name my team the Bears. Bears are really scary and intimidating. Lions, I can name it Lions. Lions are terrifying and intimidating. Tigers are terrifying and scary and intimidating. So I can name it a violent predatory animal like them. Or I can name it something that strikes that fear, that intimidates, but also has a sense of romanticism, something that romanticizes the violent conquest of the Great West, as it's called, like those old Westerns that romanticize that period. So how about I call my team Warriors, and I use the red-skinned, bloodthirsty savage as my mascot, as my team logo. Because again, it strikes that fear, it intimidates, just like these violent predatory animals, complete with a feather in his head, which is a sacred object. I know this is a humanist group. I myself am an atheist and a secular humanist, but we know that that religious symbols like the cross to Christians is very important, is very sacred, and should never be desecrated in their eyes, and how upsetting it would be for them if that were to happen. Same thing with the eagle feather. It's a very sacred thing, much deeper perhaps than the cross, being desecrated and used as a plaything here. And the tomahawk, which is a weapon of war. So the violent, the bloodthirsty savage stereotype is personified in this image. And this wasn't a figment of my imagination or something I just made up. This was only a few years ago that this intramural hockey team, this youth league hockey team, did this. Whoever started this team did exactly what I just said. What should we call this team? Let's call it something that'll be scary and intimidating. Let's go with the Warriors, and we'll make the bloodthirsty savage stereotype its mascot. But thankfully, due to activism and pressure, they changed their name, thankfully, to, I think, the Eagles, another violent, predatory animal. So to use and symbolize Native Americans in the exact same way as violent, predatory animals are is dehumanizing and racist, to say the least. these mascots also erase and make invisible our diversity. And it becomes much easier to other a group of people and discriminate against them when you believe stereotypes about them, when you put them into one homogenized monolithic group, that they all believe the same things, they all look alike, they all behave the same way, they all think and act alike, when that diversity is erased. And we're all lumped together into one monolithic nation. We are all Great Plains people of the 1800s. We're all a buffalo culture, which is pretty much the equivalent of perpetuating the idea that all Europeans are French, that the only European nation that exists is France, and that the only European language that exists is French. If you can see how wrong that is, how factually and historically wrong it is to perpetuate that idea. Oh yeah, the only Europeans that exist are French. The only country that exists in Europe is France. Then you can see how wrong it is to think and to perpetuate the idea that all Native Americans are Lakota, are a Great Plains people from the 1800s riding horses on bareback and hunting buffalo. So in the world of sports mascots, there's no Woodlands people, there's no Eastern nations, there's no Inuit, there's no Pacific Islanders or Hawaiian indigenous people. It's always this image, a black and white image of Great Plains warriors and chiefs holding weapons of war, sitting on horseback. So all these nations, these other nations that are, again, it eliminates and erases that diversity, that historical diversity. There's no Ojibwe people. All these diverse indigenous nations and communities get erased because we're all just Great Plains people of the past. I don't know how many of you are fans of Star Wars, but I can't help but think that George Lucas got his inspiration for Princess Leia's hairdo from the Hopi people, or perhaps another indigenous nation of the Americas. There's no Navajo, the largest federally recognized tribe in the nation right now in the United States. They're erased too because they're not a Great Plains culture either. So it erases our diversity, our cultural diversity. We're all just one monolithic group in the world of sports mascots. It keeps us frozen in the past, as I've already said. If we don't exist in the present, then there's no good reason to do anything to improve the lives of Native people because we're not here anymore. There's no good reason to pass legislation or policy that would improve the lives of Native people, both on the reservation and in the city or in rural regions. There's no reason to do any of that because Native people don't exist anymore. And we can't harm or hurt a people that don't exist anymore. So there's no reason or there's no good reason to do any of that. But we still exist as these wonderful books. The title alone says it all. We are still here. We didn't all die out in 1890. We've been thriving and existing ever since, for centuries. We are still here is a common message that we have to keep repeating over and over again. But there are efforts to reverse that narrative. Project 562 is a wonderful project and effort run by Matika Wilbur, who is an indigenous woman whose profession or specialty is photography. And she took it upon herself to photograph, to represent the 500 plus federally recognized tribes that exist in this country, to capture them and to represent them and photograph them how they want to be represented, how those indigenous folks want to be seen. And this is some of the results of that work, of that effort. You see the diversity. You you see that we're still alive in the 21st century. We're not dehumanizing caricatures. There's all this diversity of peoples living in the 21st century. And it flips the script on that narrative that all Native people are men, right? All the symbols that you see in sports are of male warriors and chiefs of the Great Plains, but there are Indigenous women, there are Indigenous youth, young folks, and a lot of Native cultures, women and children are at the center of their existence, of their ways of life. So these mascots also erase Indigenous women and children. But these images tell a different story, that we are peoples still living in the 21st century, and we have lives that are very similar to yours. We are your neighbors, we are your colleagues, we are your fellow coworkers, your doctors, your teachers, your lawyers, etc. So I love that effort to remind people that we are still living in the present. There are various cultural items that are trivialized and distorted in the mascot world. I've already kind of talked about them. Drumming, singing, dancing, certain aspects of religion, spirituality, they are trivialized, they are mocked and used as playthings. So I already talked about the eagle feather. I'll just say one more thing about that, which is, since the eagle is seen as the being that can fly the highest, naturally it is the Great Spirit's messenger. So it's very sacred for that reason. No one can just go out and just buy an eagle feather and have it be that, have that weight and meaning to it. The eagle feathers are given to those that earn them. And you earn one by making a huge sacrifice for your community. A lot of Native American veterans who have seen combat, Native veterans are awarded and given an eagle feather. And they earn those eagle feathers much like they earn the Congressional Medal of Honor or a Purple Heart. And we know that people that wear those things, that wear a Medal of Honor and did not earn it, we know that's something called stolen valor, and we know how disrespectful that is. So to see people parading them around and wearing them as Halloween costumes from Target or Walmart or whatever, it's very disrespectful, and it's equal to a sacrilege, a desecration of something that's very sacred. As I said, there's scientific evidence showing that these mascots actually harm Native Americans, particularly Native American youth, but they also harm non-natives. So yeah, there's over a decade's worth of scientific evidence showing that Native American sports mascots and team names cause real, measurable harm. So for natives, these mascots damage our self-esteem, our ability to imagine future possibilities for ourselves, and our sense of community worth. They instill a sense of shame for belonging to our native communities. And these mascots, they also increase negative feelings of stress, distress, depression, dysphoria, and feelings of hostility among Native people. And this is all very dangerous, considering that natives, especially Native American youth, are the most vulnerable population when it comes to suicide and depression. For non-natives who are white, these mascots increase racist attitudes, stereotyping, and increase discriminatory behavior towards Native Americans, and Asian Americans. So the scientific evidence shows that these mascots harm Asian Americans as well. And this is highly concerning, considering that white people overwhelmingly hold positions of power in politics, economics, entertainment, and education. And if they hold racist attitudes and stereotypes in their minds about Native Americans, people, human beings, they are more likely to engage in behavior that is harmful to our well-being and ways of life. And these mascots, these Native mascots, they also foster a hostile learning environment. So Native children suffer psychologically and emotionally in this kind of environment in the public schools that have these mascots. And non-Native children are taught in this environment that stereotyping and discriminating against an entire race of people is acceptable, is okay. And how can a child learn and reach their fullest potential when they're in an environment like that? They create the hostile learning environment for children. And how can a child reach their fullest potential and become who they are when they're only seen as a stereotype, when they're only seen as a relic of the past? How can they imagine any future possibilities for themselves or any future oriented achievement goals when they're constantly reminded that they don't exist and that their communities don't exist? They're relics of the past. Damages that self-esteem, that self-image of children, of Native children. And it fosters this kind of environment in our public schools. This is a high school where they throw up a banner to egg on their rivals called the Indians. Hey, Indians, get ready to leave in a trail of tears, round 2. So they're belittling a tragedy for the sake of team spirit. And this is what the children are being taught in the schools that have mascots, that it's okay to do this. Trail of Tears. This is another school. Hey, Indians, get ready for a Trail of Tears Part 2. For those of you who don't know, the Trail of Tears was a government policy carried out by the Andrew Jackson administration. He put forward these policies, and it was carried out that various Native American nations, not just the Cherokee, were sent on various death marches. And that is an act of genocide. That was a genocidal policy. When you target a group of people for what they are, who they are, and you take them and force them at gunpoint, force them off of their ancestral lands to a different location. When you do that, that is an act of genocide. That was carried out by Andrew Jackson, his administration, and the United States military, army at that time. And these children are trivializing and mocking that. And they're, in this moment, they were told it was okay. They were encouraged to do this. Scalp them. This is another high school. Scalp them, Indians. So our tax dollars are paying for this. Our tax dollars are paying for children to learn, for white children to learn that they are superior and that they can mock, stereotype, and discriminate against indigenous people. Scalp the Indians. You'll see what looks like a Native American woman hanging out of this makeshift wagon. So when children are taught that this is okay, no wonder we see an epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls when we see things like this. This is a college. College students, super drunk. This was the University of North Dakota, the Fighting Sioux. So not only are these students perpetuating the bloodthirsty savage stereotype, they're also perpetuating the drunken Indian stereotype. They have the beer bong going into the mouth of a decapitated Great Plains chief. So again, no wonder we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls when young people are in this hostile learning environment that is encouraging this kind of behavior and these kinds of attitudes towards Indigenous people. I mean, do you really need scientific evidence to show you that this is harmful, that this is detrimental to the well-being of Native children and non-Native children? There are nearly 200 public schools in Ohio right now that have a Native American sports mascot or nickname, like Indians, like the R word, Chiefs. And I've already shown you or demonstrated that it doesn't have to be the school itself that is perpetuating these kinds of stereotypes and hostile environment. Their rivals engage in this kind of behavior too by throwing up banners. So students at other schools that do not have a Native mascot, they throw up banners that egg on their rivals that say, "Scalp the Indians, send those Indians on the Trail of Tears." And these students here, again, they're carrying out in a symbolic way, but still a violent way, the legacy of their ancestors, their white Euro-American ancestors who would murder Indigenous people and decapitate them, put their heads on spikes. And they're smiling about it. This is nothing to smile about. So this is what children are being taught, that it's okay to do this, that it's okay to stereotype and discriminate against an entire race of people. And we know that young people, that students, may not have a lot of power now, but will, especially when they turn 18 and they can vote. So they are tomorrow's decision makers. They are tomorrow's power holders. And they have the power to harm Native American tribes and peoples. And they can do it with these attitudes in mind, these stereotypes in mind. And that would be very detrimental. And shouldn't we control images of ourselves? Shouldn't we control that narrative? But as I said, it's the dominant white culture that controls this imagery, that controls these team names. We have zero power over the Cleveland Major League Baseball team. We have zero power over the National Football League in Washington, the Washington team. It's non-natives who control this imagery. We have no control over it. So it's like they're telling us who we are. They're controlling that native identity. And non-natives often claim that this honors us. Hopefully by now, you see the lie in that. There's nothing, racism honors no one. Stereotypes honor no one. I've shown you that these mascots harm Native people. You don't honor a people by harming them. There are over 100 Native American tribes and Native American organizations that have called for the elimination of these mascots on all levels. And these tribes and organizations have said for decades, literally decades, this is not honorable. This does not honor us. It hurts us. It harms us. Stop it. What part of ouch don't you understand is what we've been saying for decades. And again, shouldn't we as natives say what does and does not honor us? How can someone claim to honor us when they don't know the first thing about us? You claim to honor me when you don't know me at all and you don't know who the Cheyenne people are? So all of that leads to the claim the Native American sports mascots honor Native people. It makes it ring hollow and false, which is what it is. here's just a sampling of the tribes, the Native American tribes that have called for the elimination of Native American sports mascots. The National Congress of American Indians is the oldest and largest, most representative Native American organization in the United States, representing over 200 Native American tribes. They have called for the elimination of these mascots and have done so for decades. The Navajo Nation, the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States, has called for the elimination of Native American sports mascots. The three large scientific organizations have called for the elimination of these mascots: the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association, and the American Anthropological Association have called for the elimination of these mascots based on the scientific evidence showing that they're harmful. The National Education Association has called for the elimination of these mascots. So there's no honor here, and we've been saying so for decades. Often people will point to flawed or misleading polls published by newspapers, trying to make the argument that, hey, Native Americans are okay with this. They don't care, they're honored, they say it's okay. And then I always, just to counter it, say, well, here's an opinion poll from a news source that says the exact opposite, just to kind of make them stop and say, like, let's think about this critically for a second. But we need to see actual data. We need to see empirical ways used to really measure the attitudes in a scientific way, the attitudes and opinions of Native people, and that's been done. So the Washington R-word name, Native mascots offend more than previously reported. When this was published not long ago, of those polled for the study, 57% of Native people who strongly identify with being Native American participate in tribal elections, participate in spiritual ceremonies and cultural ways. Though Native people who strongly identify as being Native, 67% of those who frequently engage in their tribal cultural practices were found to be deeply insulted by caricatures of Native American cultures. So these wonderful graphics by Illuminative reflect and illustrate that data. So 65% of Native people are offended by the use of the tomahawk chop by fans, by the Atlanta Braves and the Kansas City Chiefs football team. 65% of Native youth are highly offended and are opposed to Native mascots. So the overwhelming majority of Native youth oppose and are offended by these mascots. The overwhelming majority of Native people are offended by the tomahawk chop. 70% of Native people are offended by the wearing of headdresses by fans. It's hurtful to see that. 70%. 67% of Native people involved in their communities are offended by the name of the Washington football team, a dictionary-defined racial slur. So if you have anything, if you have anyone telling you anything other than this, you know it's a lie, you know it's misleading because it's not consistent with the data. This is what the data says. Published peer-reviewed data shows the overwhelming majority of Native people are offended and want these mascots eliminated. No matter how you break it down, youth. If that's not enough, if nothing what I said is enough, we have the behavior of fans. When, so what happens when Native Americans stand up and tell sports fans and sports teams, this is hurtful and harmful, stop doing this, it's hurting us? What happens? We get letters like this that say, from this sports fan who says, makes me long for ethnic cleansing. this is a Cleveland baseball fan, by the way, makes me long for ethnic cleansing. The same fan goes on to say, we should have exterminated your kind when we had the justice and the law on our side. Now it's too late. So we'll just have to let you sorry SOBs self-destruct. That's hatred. What is going on in this Cleveland baseball fan's mind to where he's gotten to the point where he would rather see me, my mother, my sister, my grandfather, my uncles, my cousins, he would rather see us wiped off the face of the earth than to have his favorite sports team change its name. So this is the kind of hostile environment that the Cleveland baseball team has been perpetuating and fostering for decades, for over a century. Redface seems acceptable. Blackface seems to get more pushback than redface. But it seems that redface is more acceptable. What is this teaching children? Here are adults in the professional sports world. That behavior is being done in front of children. And this fan here, his sign is very clear. They say, you're racist. I say, tell me something I don't know. Mwah. So this fan is making it very clear. Yeah, what I'm doing is racist and harmful, and I don't care. I don't care about indigenous people. I don't care about the well-being of children. I care about me. I care about my entertainment. I care about my good times and my fun times. I don't care about you. It's about me. So thankfully, finally, that straw that broke the camel's back finally gave in and said, okay, now it's time to listen to indigenous people because we've been ignoring them for decades. Now it's time to listen and seriously consider. And thankfully, the Cleveland baseball team announced in December that they are going to change their name, and it's not going to be anything that's Native American themed. And that's inevitably what happens. They listened to us. They listened to the Native people of Cleveland, of Northeast Ohio. They listened to Native American academics who understand the scientific evidence showing harm. They listened to Native leaders, people. And what inevitably happens when you do that is changing the name of the baseball team and changing it away from Native themed mascots and team names because we know that it's harmful. So contrary to popular belief, we are still fighting. Native people, indigenous people are still here. We are fighting for sovereignty rights, for human rights. We are fighting to protect the land. We're resisting the encroachment of invading oil pipelines that poison land, destroy land, and poison and destroy water supplies. Protecting our children, we're protecting the water, we're protecting the land, the people from that violence. We're still hoping for a better future for our children. We're constantly thinking about 7 generations ahead of us. how is what I'm doing right now going to impact 7 generations ahead of me? We are constantly thinking about that and gearing our actions toward that. I guarantee you, this current administration is not thinking in those terms. So we're still hoping for a better future. And I thank you all for listening, and I thank you all for allowing me to be here today. And I hope that you've understood this issue a little better, and I hope that you'll become advocates for positive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Did anyone have any questions? I was going to start off, one that came to mind was if you have a local high school team that has the Red Riders or Indians or something like that, how would you recommend getting involved in trying to change that?
Yeah. There's actually ways to do it that are more effective than others. So if it's a school that's in your community, like you've lived in that community for a long time, and that's a strong voice to use. I've lived here for a long time, and it's time for this school to change its nickname. So getting the school's superintendent to understand this issue and to understand the harm, getting the school board members, to at least enough of them, the majority of them, usually it's 3 out of 5, getting them to understand and to make that change. Principals, to a lesser extent, are helpful in that fight. And when possible, centering Indigenous voices, whether it's natives who live in that community, or getting natives that represent different organizations to show up at a school board meeting and to say, yes, I am Native, this is hurtful and harmful, and you need to change it. So it comes down to using strategies to get school board members to understand and listen, to get superintendents to listen and understand. And getting them on board with that is how you make the change. And centering Native voices and centering people who live in that community. Because in general, especially when it's a small community, outsiders are not listened to, are just kind of shoved aside, and whether they're Native or not. Like if I'm Native American and there's a school in Cincinnati, it doesn't matter that I'm Native in their minds. I'm a stranger, I'm an outsider. I live up here in Cleveland. So mobilizing those local communities, people who live in that community, mobilizing them and educating them, those that want to make change, and then convincing the school board members and the superintendent on principles that it needs to change. So that's it in a nutshell.
I have